At first glance, what happened seems clear. Iran backed down after just a few days of pressure from the United States, opened the Strait of Hormuz, discussed the nuclear program, and there were even talks about enriched uranium. But if you break it down, it's not that simple. There are two different stories. On Donald Trump's side, according to his statement, it's as if the Strait of Hormuz is completely open, and there's even an indication that the sea mines are being removed. This means that ship movements will return to normal. But on Iran's side, the tone is different. But before we start, don't forget to like this video. It means a lot to us content creators. Thank you very much, and now let's get started. According to the statement of the foreign minister, the opening of the strait is just part of the ceasefire, and most importantly, it is not permanently open. It's only temporary until the agreement ends. And there's another important detail. It's not just open for everyone, only through coordinated routes. This means that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps still has control over where the ships will pass. This is not a total surrender. It looks more like a controlled opening. It's like Iran is saying, you can pass through, but in a way where we still hold control. And this is where the situation becomes clear. This is not simply a win for the US or a loss for Iran. This is a compromise that both sides are trying to present as a victory. On the US side, they're showing that the pressure worked. On Iran's side, they're showing that they didn't completely lose control. And that's where the most important point comes in, the narrative. Because in this kind of situation, it's not just the action that matters, but also how it's presented to the public. That's why now there are two possible truths that exist at the same time. One version says that Iran surrendered, and another version says they just adjusted to survive. The truth is somewhere in the middle. And the more critical question now is, what will happen when the ceasefire ends? Because if the reopening is only temporary, the tension could return at any time. And if that happens, all of this could start all over again. If we follow that logic, the conclusion seems clear. Someone is lying. But here, we need to be careful, because what you see on AIS and maritime traffic isn't always the whole story. Yes, there are ships that pass through the middle of the Strait of Hormuz. Some have their transponders on, while others have them off. And it looks like they're using the usual routes that were used before the conflict. But this doesn't necessarily mean that Iran is lying. There are three possible explanations for this. First, selective enforcement. Some ships might be allowed to pass, especially if they're not directly connected to Iranian territory, or if there's coordination happening behind the scenes. Second, timing. Some ships were able to enter or cross before the new rules or announcements were fully enforced. That's why sometimes the data seems contradictory. Third, messaging war. In situations like this, both sides are trying to control the narrative. The United States wants to show that the blockade is effective. Iran wants to show that it still has control over the flow. And in the middle of this, there are actual movements that don't immediately match the official statements. As for the point that the strait is already wide open, that's a somewhat risky conclusion, because even if some ships have managed to get through, it doesn't mean that the situation is back to normal. A more realistic picture is that it's partially open, but the risk is high and the rules are unpredictable. And yes, there's probably one thing that's right in your analysis. The blockade brings a lot of pressure. According to reports, a large part of Iran's economy depends on sea trade through the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman. If that gets cut off, the economy really won't be able to last long. So the reason they're giving in now might not be because they want to, but because they have no choice in the short term. But this doesn't mean that they've completely given up. This looks more like a tactical step, a temporary adjustment to catch their breath. Because in this kind of geopolitical conflict, total surrender rarely happens suddenly. More often it's gradual and comes with a corresponding next move. So the better question now isn't who's lying, nor how long the situation will remain open. Because that's where the real decision will be made about who truly has control. There's a point when it comes to money. Even if the quote isn't exactly from Napoleon Bonaparte, the idea is still correct. You need money for war. And in Iran's current situation, that's really what the problem revolves around. When revenue is cut off, especially from oil, the country's ability to continue the conflict gradually weakens. This is the reason why, according to observations, they are becoming more open to negotiations. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the discussions are immediately fair. It's more accurate to say that they are forced to talk because of the pressure. As for oil prices, it's normal for them to go down when there are signs that routes like the Strait of Hormuz will open up. When the market thinks that more oil will be able to get out, the price automatically goes down. So even if there's tension, if there's a slight opening of the route, the global market reacts immediately. Now, your observation that the strait is open but the blockade at the Iranian ports continues, that's the most important detail. It means the impact is uneven. Global trade is allowed to move, but Iran's own exports are being restricted. That's true. On the ground, that's really a lot of pressure. But don't conclude right away that the fight is over, because in situations like this, the strategy often has different parts. One side may retreat in one area, but is preparing in another way. The statement from the Pentagon, that's a natural part of psychological pressure. In conflicts like this, it's not just weapons that are used, but also messages. They show their superiority to deter the opponent. But it's important to remember, even though the United States has an advantage in military and intelligence, it doesn't mean they control the entire outcome. Because Iran, even though it's weak in open confrontation, still has the capability for an asymmetric response. And that's what can change the course of the situation at any time. So the most realistic assessment right now is yes, there's strong pressure on Iran. Yes, they're adjusting, but this is not yet the end of the fight. This is just the stage where each side is testing the limits of the other. Statements like these from the Pentagon aren't just simple updates. They're part of a pressure strategy. They're showing that not only can they stop the ships, but they can also target deeper parts of Iran's system, like energy and infrastructure. And based on reports, all ships that tried to pass from Iranian ports were stopped. If this is true on the ground, that's a big indication that enforcement in the Strait of Hormuz is effective. The example you mentioned about the U.S. Navy's radio communication, that's really how actual enforcement at sea works. It's not immediately aggressive. First, there's a warning. After that, compliance. And usually the goal is to make the ship back off without having to escalate the situation. Now, regarding Donald Trump's claim that Iran will never close the strait again, that's where we need to be realistic. There needs to be an agreement that can permanently remove that option, because honestly, that's Iran's last leverage. If they feel cornered again, there's a high possibility they'll use that, even if there's a risk. So your instinct to question that is correct. This isn't a simple on-off switch that they can walk away from for good. But there's something more important to see here. As the situation drags on, Iran's power in Hormuz is gradually weakening. Not because they've lost their capability, but because other countries are learning. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and other Gulf states are now seeing how risky it is to rely on a single choke point. And because of this, they're speeding up the creation of alternative routes. If there are more alternative routes, even if Iran can still disrupt the Strait of Hormuz, its impact on the world will be much less. And that's the real long-term change. Iran's leverage won't disappear right away, but it will gradually decrease, not through direct confrontation, but by avoiding the very place where they are strong. So what's happening now is that two timelines are running simultaneously. In the short term, the U.S. pressure is strong. In the long term, the value of Hormuz as leverage is gradually diminishing. And in the middle of this, Iran is in a dangerous position. Because as they lose their leverage, they need to decide how to adjust before the whole game turns against them. The Gulf countries are gradually changing their strategy. Saudi Arabia has a pipeline that crosses the country to the Red Sea, so they no longer need to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. The United Arab Emirates is doing the same, with a direct route to the Gulf of Oman. This means that even if there is tension in Hormuz, their exports will continue. And even Iraq is already discussing long-distance pipelines to Europe. This won't happen right away. You're right, this will take years. But what's important is that it has already started, and if this goes through, Iran's leverage in Hormuz will gradually disappear. It's not sudden, but the shift is permanent. Now, what's more interesting is what's happening inside Iran. Because while all of this is happening outside, there's also pressure inside. According to reports and reactions on social media, many Iranians are not happy with the government's decision. There's a sense of shame. There's a feeling of questioning what the sacrifice was for, especially since some officials and soldiers have already died. And when public emotions are like this, it becomes dangerous for the leadership. It doesn't necessarily mean there will be a rebellion right away, but dissatisfaction is growing. On top of that, there's confusion in the message. There are reports that the government's explanation is unclear about what's really happening. And when information isn't clear, frustration spreads more quickly. But here, a little balance is needed. Not everything you see on Telegram or social media is the full picture of public opinion. There is real anger, but some of the information may be exaggerated or biased. So it's safer to say there is backlash. But we still can't say how big it is across the whole country. Now about uranium. If it's true that Iran is ready to give this up, it's an even bigger deal than the Hormuz issue. Because Hormuz is external leverage, but uranium is the core identity of the regime. If they let go of both, it's not just the strategy that changes, but the entire direction of Iran as a state. So the question now is not just why they retreated, but how far they are willing to retreat. Because if this continues, it's possible that not only the foreign policy will change, but also the very core of their system. First, Donald Trump's statement about nuclear dust was probably a metaphor or simplified wording for enriched uranium and debris from the strikes. It's not just literal dust being discussed, but the actual nuclear material that's dangerous when left behind. Now, regarding uranium, 60% enriched uranium is close to weapons-grade level. It's not directly a bomb yet, but it's much faster to convert compared to low-enriched uranium. This has been a long-standing issue, which is why the US and others want to take it out of Iran's control. But this is important. The claim that Iran will hand over the uranium should be treated as still in the negotiation stage. It's not final yet. At this level of discussion, there are often many versions of the deal that come out in the media. Some are true, while others are used to put pressure on the other side. As for the $20 billion, the explanation you mentioned is more realistic. This is not a payment from the United States. Instead, it's possibly access to frozen Iranian assets. That means it's still Iran's money, which is frozen because of sanctions and used as a bargaining chip. If this happens, it would be like a trade-off. Access to the money in exchange for reducing or giving up nuclear capability. But it's not that simple either, because even if the 60% stockpile is given up, there are two things that remain. First, the knowledge and technology. You can't erase the expertise they've already built. Second, the infrastructure. Even if the facilities are destroyed or damaged, they can be rebuilt in the future if there are resources. So at the international level, the goal isn't just to take the uranium, it's to extend the time before they can return to the same level. And this is where the bigger picture comes in. If this kind of deal is true, it's not a simple surrender. It looks more like a forced compromise. Pressure from the blockade, military strikes, and economic crisis, all combined. That's why Iran is being forced to give up their most important card. But that doesn't mean the discussion is over. Honestly, this is just the beginning of a more complicated phase. Because after a deal like this, the next question is, how do you make sure it doesn't happen again? And that's often where new tensions arise. You made a good point, especially about it not being realistic, to expect something without anything in return. That's really where the focus should be, because that's the most critical part. First, when talking about this kind of deal, it's really not normal for a country to give such a huge asset without anything in return. For Iran, enriched uranium is not just a simple material. It is strategic leverage and a symbol of power. So if they give it up, it's almost certain that there's something in exchange for it, even if it's not clear to the public yet. Donald Trump's statements, especially the claim that no money is being given in exchange, could just be part of his positioning. In these kinds of negotiations, it's important how you present yourself to the public. The United States doesn't want to appear as if it's compromising, especially in the eyes of its own people. It's also possible that the talks aren't final yet, which is why the information coming out keeps changing. The issue of the moratorium is even more important than the uranium itself. If the U.S. wants no enrichment for 20 years and Iran only wants 5 years, that's really what the toughest part of the negotiation will revolve around. Because even if you get the uranium now, if there's still the capability to enrich in the future, the problem will just come back. Even if it's not direct money that's given, there are other ways for Iran to recover. It could be sanctions relief, access to frozen assets, or easing of trade. Any of these will have the same effect. They will have temporary economic relief that they need to recover. This isn't simply a positive development either. Just to be clear, it's true that if the nuclear risk is reduced, it will have a positive effect on the world, but on a deeper level, it's just an exchange. One type of tension was reduced, but it was replaced by new dynamics in politics and power. If there's an upcoming meeting in Islamabad, it's clear that the talks are already at a critical stage. That's where it will be tested how much each side is willing to give and what kind of agreement will be formed. This is not yet the end of the story. This is just the beginning of a more complicated part of the game. And if we take the discussion further, there's another aspect that hardly gets noticed. Its effect on how the world plans for the next crisis. Because of what happened, countries are not just fixing the current problem. They're also thinking about how to prevent this from happening again. According to some reports and analyses, many countries are starting to change their long-term strategy, not just in energy, but in the entire supply system. For example, they're strengthening local storage. They're also increasing strategic reserves, and they're putting more value on redundancy. It's no longer enough to have just one source. There needs to be a second and a third, and if possible, another backup as well. Along with this, there's another angle. The role of the private sector is becoming even more important. Before, the government was the main actor in situations like this, but now, large companies are the first to adjust. According to industry reports, there are shipping firms that voluntarily avoid high-risk routes, not because of any order, but because of risk assessment. And when this happens, the system changes faster. Because it's no longer waiting for policy, it's happening through actual business activity. If you look at this over a longer period, if more companies become more cautious, the system will become more stable. But there's a trade-off. Higher costs, longer routes, slower delivery. This means the world is possibly moving toward a more expensive but safer system. And this is the trade-off that everyone is gradually accepting. Aside from this, there's another important point, the role of uncertainty. In this kind of situation, not everything is clear, and sometimes what isn't clear is more dangerous. Because when countries are uncertain, they become more defensive. Their actions become more conservative, and they avoid risks even more. And when everyone has this mindset, the whole system slows down, not because something is holding it back, but because everyone is being cautious. If we look deeper into global relationships, as this kind of tension drags on, the way countries interact changes. It's no longer just about alliances, but about flexibility. There are countries that can talk to both sides. There are countries that can adjust depending on the situation. And this is the new kind of strategy. It's not fixed, but dynamic. And in this kind of setup, the countries that know how to balance become stronger. Not the strongest, but the most adaptable. At the end of all this, we go back to a simple realization. This crisis isn't just about what happened now. It's about how it changes what comes next. Because every decision we make now becomes the basis for decisions tomorrow. And every move has a different effect that lasts longer than the fight itself. In the end, the real question isn't who won today, but who is more prepared for a world that's slowly changing because of what happened. And if we continue in this direction, there's another quiet change that's starting to be felt, its effect on the very pace of the global economy. Before, the goal was to speed everything up, faster shipping, faster production. faster delivery. Some parts of the system are gradually slowing down, not because there's a problem, but because it's being intentionally slowed down. According to some analyses, some companies now prefer controlled speed, not the fastest, but the most predictable. Because of this situation, the most dangerous thing is not slowness, but unpredictability. Now let's think about its effect on daily life. When the route is longer, the cost increases. When the cost increases, the prices go up. And when the prices go up, people feel it. Not just in gas prices, but in food, products, and services too. And even if they don't know the details of what's happening in Hormuz, they feel the effect. This is what's called the ripple effect. From a narrow passage in the sea, all the way to the prices of goods in other parts of the world. Now there's another angle that's even deeper, its effect on market confidence. Whenever there's tension at this level, investors become cautious. Less risk is taken, safe assets are preferred. And when this happens, investment slows down. And when investment slows down, economic growth also slows down. Not immediately, but gradually. Now, according to some reports, there are times when even a small piece of news immediately triggers a market reaction. A single statement, a movement of a ship, a change in policy. And this can immediately be seen in the prices. This means the system is more sensitive now. The reaction is faster, but the volatility is also higher. And this is the new normal. From another perspective, this affects the long-term planning of governments. Before, a 5-year plan was enough. There was a clear direction. Things moved predictably. But now it's harder to plan long-term because situations change faster. That's why the approach now is more flexible, more ready to adjust, more ready to change the plan when needed. And this is becoming the new standard. Not the most detailed plan, but the one that's most adaptable. Now there's another subtle effect, the change in priorities. Before, the focus was on growth, on expansion, on increasing revenue, but now stability is more important. Resilience, the ability to endure even during a crisis. And this is the shift that's gradually happening. Not dramatic, not headline-worthy, but it has a big impact. When you put all of this together, it's like the direction of the world is slowly changing, from fast and efficient to safe and stable. It doesn't mean that innovation is disappearing, but the focus is changing. More thought is given to risk, more thought is given to the long term, more emphasis on sustainability. And in this way, this crisis is not just an event, it's a turning point, a moment when the priorities of the whole system began to change. And in the end, the full impact might not be immediately seen. But as time goes by, this will dictate how the world will move, how fast it moves, how resilient it will be, and how prepared it will be for the next challenge. Because in modern times, true strength is not just in the speed of progress, but in the ability to remain resilient, even as everything continues to change. And if we continue in this direction, there will be another effect, the change in how information is treated. Before, an official statement was enough, but now people scrutinize what is actually happening. They look at ship movements, market movements. This means that words are no longer enough. They need to match actions. And when they don't match, that's when doubt begins. When there is doubt, trust builds more slowly. And when trust grows slowly, decisions become more cautious. And when decisions are slow, the system slows down. Now, because of this, countries become more cautious with every statement. They think more about how it will be received. And in this way, the style of diplomacy changes. It's quieter, more carefully considered. Going forward, sudden escalation might be avoided, but there's a trade-off. Tension lasts longer, uncertainty increases. And in the end, there's one question. In a changing world, who has the advantage? The one who acts quickly or the one who knows how to wait? Because sometimes victory isn't about speed, but about reading the situation correctly. And as time goes by, it becomes clearer that the most important thing isn't who leads or who acts first, but who doesn't make a mistake in the end. And that's also where you measure who's truly prepared, not by how fast they start, but by how steady they move until the end. Because in this kind of battle, a small but correct decision can make a big impact.